Wonderful. Thank you. First of all, I would like to thank to the BNM for inviting me to moderate this session. This really is, of course, unbiased, the gem of the next 2 days, because there are 4 economists here and 3 wonderful economists, and we are really, we are going to have a great time. But first of all, may I just clarify a couple of things? This session is probably tighter than what some might think, because the monetary policy, that's what we are talking about here, one of the things. So it is not the other aspects of what central bank does. On the side of fiscal policy, we would like to focus on the macro stabilization aspect of fiscal policy, as opposed to more structural kind of things. So the article that was mentioned by the Bank Negara talks about that. Well, a few minutes of background on the issue, if I may. The fiscal policy issues have been at the forefront even before the COVID. You might remember that discussion by people like Olivier Blanchard about low interest rates. This is the time governments should borrow and invest, kind of thing. Then there came COVID. The fiscal capacity, if you like, was, or limits, have reached some unprecedented levels in many jurisdictions, that the GDP ratios had gone up, budget deficits, and so on. Now the COVID is over, that landscape is changing, that levels have to be reduced, and so on. With that background, the Malaysia is slightly more interesting or exciting, if you may, because the fiscal landscape is changing very fast. The introduction of the Public Finance and Fiscal Responsibility Act, the further changes, they are going to change the fiscal landscape completely in this country, and that's going to have implications for monetary policy in terms of how we interact, right? The monetary policy, if you may, need to re-optimize, and the way monetary policy responds to fiscal landscape will in turn have implications for fiscal policy. And we don't want to be in a place where probably either policy is overburdened, you know. How can we, and if you like, in that region of stability, or make sure we don't deviate from that region of stability. But with that, may I just turn to Ajifra about COVID-era policies, monetary policy, but I'll leave the fiscal policy to Dr. Nugsari. Did we respond enough? Were they effective? Could we have done more?
Okay. Thank you, Ozer, for the question. A very good afternoon. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you for having me here. If we cast our mind back towards COVID, it was a time when we had unprecedented shocks hitting the economy at the same time. So, of course, it is a time when monetary policy and fiscal policy work in concert towards stabilizing the economy and, importantly, reducing the possible scarring effect. Had we done enough? I think I'll break it down into 2 parts. First, we need to talk about what we did during COVID, our action in order to mitigate all the downside effects. And also, it's important by now for us to reflect on how we recover, how do we come out of it. So during COVID, of course, you know, we heard in the earlier session where, because of the nature of the shocks, policymakers threw everything, including the kitchen sinks, everything, in containing the after effects of COVID on the economy. As a matter of context, globally, the global median policy rate came down from about 1.5 in 2019 to 0.1 in 2021. So there was massive interest rate cuts. In many countries, it was cut to historical lows, including us. And then for the fiscal deficit, it turned from minus 0.9 global median to about plus 5.1 by 2021. Now, that was a huge swing, about 5 percentage points. So what for Malaysia, we reduced interest rates to historical low by 125 basis points. Simultaneously also, monetary policy is a blunt instrument. It's not enough. We had successive rounds of fiscal policy stimulus, and on top of that, we also have, for example, financial measures, moratorium, EPF withdrawals, many others, temporary relief to help the economy. So what we've done is really, to a great extent, stem the scarring. And then we had the global turnaround in the sense that, you had suddenly, because of the excess stimulus and the uneven nature, which prolongs the stimulus, allows the economy to recover quickly. Many recorded a V-shaped recovery, and there's inflation. And because inflation, central banks start raising up interest rates very, very quickly. So we had a situation where you threw everything, and then from a monetary policy perspective, we withdraw everything pretty fast. Is it enough? Is it enough? I think, looking back, we were successful for Malaysia in reducing the scarring effect. We had a quick recovery. We had, by and large, we didn't have an inflation situation where it misbehaved. Inflation was somewhat well contained. A lot of it has also to do with fiscal, but I'm sure Dr. Nugsari will explain to us a lot more later. But at the same time, we managed to ensure that the recovery is relatively smooth, right? So we came into it and then we withdraw. So Bank Negara is one of the first to normalize interest rates. Now, the operative word here is normalize. We did not tighten because we did not have a situation where the inflation was misbehaving. At the same time also, there were challenges because the recovery was somewhat uneven. It's far from clear that we are clear. But inflation was rising, and inflation wasn't just a supply shock situation. There were also a lot of demand elements given the scale of stimulus that we've seen. Not as much as, say, the US, but we saw some. So the decision for monetary policy is for us to, while we limit the scarring, while we are normalizing, is to ensure that inflation is within striking distance of monetary policy. We did not have to resort to a situation where we had to constrict the economy or crimp the recovery. We did not have a situation where inflation needs vigorous monetary policy reaction, but yet we had to raise interest rates to avoid it being too low for too long and creating other problems. So that got us back 125 basis points between May and within a year, we were back to where we were pre-COVID. So net, it's not enough for monetary policy alone. Fiscal policy also came in to do enough for us, I think, not too much, not too little, for us to get the economy on an even keel. But at the same time, let's be real. We spent our bullets. We exhausted our buffers. And so the immediate task for us now is, when the economy is stable, when the economy is recovering nicely, where there is a lot of more zest in the economy, it's time for us to claw back the bullets used and rebuild our buffer. I'll pause here.
Thank you. Dr. Nugsari, on fiscal policy side, did we do enough? What could we have done differently? Or in this new fiscal landscape, the new fiscal landscape we have, do you think that might have allowed us to do things differently in a better way?
Well, thank you for having me, and thank you for having me to say something about fiscal policy in Bank Negara instead of in Treasury, so I can be more candid about this. I think, see, what Fraz said earlier, I think from a fiscal perspective, we've never been counter-cyclical. We've been counter-cyclical during the 2021 because there was a contraction. We can say we did that in 2008, 2009, and we did that in 97, 98. But in between those years, one of the things that I have learned as somebody get involved in these things is that the application of fiscal policy has never been counter-cyclical. It's been mostly, if you start using it, you don't know how to withdraw it. And therefore, if you look at the expenditure side, which is supposed to be the part that actually augments shrinkage in demand, we've been doing that, I think, not well enough, that a whole bunch of the budget which is the fiscal tool on the expenditure side, is largely non-discretionary. So it doesn't really, if 60% of the budget is non-discretionary, then it's not much of a tool. And if the development expenditure, which represents public investment, is such a small part of the overall GDP, for example, it's like what? It's 90 billion this year for an economy of 1.7 trillion. So, the tail that's trying to wag the dog is getting smaller. So that's one issue. But at the same time, on the revenue side of things, in particular on the taxation policy side, textbooks would go into rather esoteric questions whether a project should be funded by increasing tax or borrowings, things of that sort. But what we have gone through because of this experiment, the experience that we've gone through, and partly it has to do with a bit of a resource curse element. We've never really broadened and strengthened the tax side. So we have never really been that good at that because of the oil thing. And it's something that we should recognize a bit more, because even at the peak, tax revenue to GDP was always below 20, 18, 16%, and now it's gone below 12. And what has happened, therefore, is the accumulation of debt. And that's the intersection between fiscal policy and the monetary side of the economy, because then it has an impact on the capital markets and therefore on the sensitivity of the application of monetary policy and the sustainability of the fiscal side of things. So I think we need to do a much better job. You alluded to this FRA, the Fiscal Responsibility Act. I think looking forward, I think the Act, which hasn't attracted much commentary, I thought, even among parliamentarians who passed the law, they should speak a bit more about that. But there should also be a recognition now that the application of fiscal policy itself has become distortionary rather than counter-cyclical on the demand side. For example, what was announced last couple of days ago on diesel, a prolonged period of using fiscal tool to subsidize prices has created a distortion that has resulted in huge misallocation of resources, and that I hope there's some academics here who would do studies on this. Instead of addressing aggregate demand, fiscal tool has actually altered relative prices by the application of subsidies in a pervasive level, and that has affected incentive structures and therefore have misallocated resources in a very massive way. And that leads to the structural question that we say we don't want to talk about that, but in many ways that became a problem towards a structural thing, and then it comes back in the form of revenue and growth, and then it presents an interesting problem to the monetary side of the policy framework. So, yeah, I think I'll stop there first as an opening remark.
Yes, central banks do end up being the residual claimants of anything and everything these days. Dr. Carmelo, I know you feel strongly about the longer-term effects of fiscal policy. I wonder what you might say about the Malaysian fiscal policy, not only during COVID period, but over a longer period of time.
Thank you. So, only with regard to Malaysia, not the international
point.
So, I have to say, to go back to the topic, and if my slides can be put on, looking in perspective of what has been done as the assistant director, the assistant governor was saying during the period of COVID, we can compare the Malaysian situation with what has happened in a more aggressive way in the West, where I call it as a tale of overtrust in fiscal policy and whatever it takes in monetary policy, to quote Mario Draghi, if you remember. So what have happened during the period of COVID is that there has been initially a policy response, not fiscal or monetary, but just a health policy response that was induced by panic rather than by trade-off analysis and rather by science. Policymakers were taken over by the anxiety of doing something, and I can understand that. And this has led, in particular in the West, to a very aggressive fiscal expansion that has created long-term consequences that we see now. We see now how the United States are struggling to put down inflation despite a very aggressive tightening monetary policy. And this, indeed, has been done with the idea of underestimated the fact that fiscal expansion can have long-term consequences, and long-term consequences means situations that change and change in a way that they remain in a certain way. And the words of doctor here were music to my ear when I heard about the distortion of the system of relative prices and how this has created a long-term story of misallocation of resources in Malaysia in the long term. And somehow during COVID, monetary policy had to follow, to accommodate what was happening in fiscal policy, and we see that this has created is creating a story of rates that remain too low for too long, in particular in the Western world. This is not much the case of Malaysia, as has been just pointed out. Indeed, Malaysia was very fast in getting back to the pre-COVID level of interest rates, but the fiscal expansion accompanied by monetary expansion in the Western world has been so much more aggressive than what has been in this part of the world, that then the long-term consequences have been much stronger. Inflation came, and I think the hope of policymakers in charge of fiscal policy was somehow later on monetary policy will get it fixed. We create inflation, later on the central bank will fix it. And this is more or less what happened, and I think at a certain extent is what happened also in Malaysia, although on a more limited scale. This brings me to some concluding thoughts for this first part of the conversation, is that in general, I think we have too much faith in the automatic power of policy, being it fiscal or monetary. So I do believe that nothing is automatic when we deal with the economy, because the economy is made of billions of inter-individual interactions, and therefore what we cannot predict is much more than what we can predict, and we can talk about cyclical policies or counter-cyclical, but what actually we can do is very little, at least what we can do without moving like elephants in the room. No? So we always risk to break something. And this brings me to the conclusion. So policy making is not just pressing button of a machine. We don't deal with an engine. So policy making is more of an art. And as an art, needs a lot of evaluations on the unintended consequences that it can bring along.
Okay. Dr. Nugsari, you mentioned a fiscal policy not being a counter-cyclical in Malaysia. Do you think that has overburdened monetary policy doing more than it should have? But at the same time, if I look at the interest rate volatility in Malaysia, it is not widely more volatile than other countries. Maybe that's because fiscal policy was helping you on the inflation side.
Yeah, inflation is muted because of the subsidies. You know, if I mean that's the case for Malaysia, but it makes life easier for the central bank in that sense. But at a heavy price on fiscal balances, and so we've grown the deficit from, what was it, 30% of GDP after the Asian financial crisis to 60% of GDP. And then the day of reckoning will come or has arrived. So now we're looking at 1.5 trillion, and all the income tax that is being paid by people in this room is not enough to service the outstanding debts. So if one were to say that the Fed, for example, is obsessed with inflation targeting, right? I think for too long in the country, we were obsessed on the fiscal side with growth targeting. And you're trying to use a fiscal tool to achieve an accounting number. So you said, oh, we need to grow at 5% real, 4% real, and then you start to do things just to achieve that number, as opposed to use fiscal policy in a more meaningful way to affect structural changes. But then we leave behind the adjustment to interest rate, to the monetary policy, and they are mindful because they know the outstanding MGS out there and GIIs out there. But the government also has been creative, because then the government uses all the government guarantees, sukuk, which is outside of the overall fiscal situation, but it's something that the government now has to pay. So right now we have, what, total about 1.5 trillion outstanding debts. So we should be a bit more precise in the application of fiscal policy, rather than trying to just use fiscal policy to achieve just an accounting target of growth. And therefore, but then we've come to a point where even that is a luxury, because the bullets that we have to affect structural change has actually shrunk quite a bit. So now, if you ask me, and I'm the wrong person to talk about this because I'm actually a microeconomist, we need to settle the sustainability part of fiscal policy first before we can do the more meaningful part of fiscal policy to use it to affect structural change.
Okay. Before I turn to Ajifra on those comments, can we have Slido so people can send their questions? Wonderful. Ajifra, you heard two different things, or maybe similar in some sense. Dr. Carmelo is saying, maybe we expect too much from policy. Of course, being a former central banker, I'm not there, but what do you think?
I think we've heard about us venturing into areas that are slightly riskier as far as policy is concerned. Let me revisit what you said at the beginning about the region of stability. This is a concept put forward by some very smarter economists than me that talks about how, in a situation where fiscal policy and monetary policy works in tandem, such that both, as an instrument of ensuring economic stability, works well. So to the extent that they both work, they are aligned, they respect each other, they are in coherence, in policy coherence, you have a good policy coordination, you have a good policy mix to deliver short-term growth, at least. And at the same time, because of the right policy mix, you send the right signal to the markets, you limit, for example, the instances of financial instability risk, and that also augurs well for confidence and is good for the long term for the economy. Now, of course, what defines this region of stability has a lot to do with each policy playing its part and paying attention to one another so that they move in the same direction. And then at the same time, there are structural factors, things like the structure of the economy, the state of debt, the state of indebtedness, to allow it to work in tandem well. So what Professor Nung alluded to is that and also to some extent, yeah, Carmelo, is how we are edging closer to the boundary of that region of stability. Now, let me rephrase that in the sense that we are still within that region of stability. We have granted, like Dr. Dung said, we have always been expansionary as far as fiscal concern. It's a question of adjusting the dosage. Sometimes it's a lot, sometimes it's little, and we used it a lot during COVID, of course. And we are edging closer to the boundary of that region of stability. And now is the time to actually rein it back. Hence all the conversation about reforms, the tax reforms, the diesel subsidy, restructuring, and all those things. So from the point of view of monetary policy, when we do a monetary policy, we always look at fiscal for two reasons. One is the short term, and then another is the long term. For the short term, of course, we look at fiscal to ensure that how much stimulus is there. You mentioned stimulus. How much stimulus is there? What is the state of the economy such that we can calibrate policy such that we are aligned? Now, by and large, we are roughly aligned. We work in the same direction. The government would reduce its dosage when inflation or some imbalances are getting out of hand. That has been the case all this while. But of course, there are instances where, like you said now, we have to pay attention to the longer term consequences, things that could arise when we are outside this region of stability. Will be concerned about, for example, fiscal dominance, to the extent that whatever we do, we have to pay an overt amount of attention to the fiscal situation, because we don't want to, for example, the debt repayment to get out of hand. We are not there, but we should pay attention to it. We want to avoid a crowding out effect where, the prevalence of the government in the markets are so huge, it sucks out the ability for the markets to finance, for example, private investments. We want to avoid, for example, also risk of financial stability because, market rates are not fully adjusted to the situation. So all in, this conference is about reforms. It's about us, bringing things back to within a comfortable domain of the region of stability. I'll pause here.
Perfect. Let's now move to a more forward-looking part of this conversation. As I mentioned at the beginning, the landscape of fiscal policy is changing with the legislation that we talked about and additional things that are coming. What are the effects of these reforms on fiscal policy going to be, Dr. Nugsari? On fiscal side, what do you think are the priorities? Are we going to have more automatic stabilizers? Or how do you see the new landscape?
No, I think one of the things that have gone underappreciated is actually the Fiscal Responsibility Act. I think it's an act that actually, well, the old name for it in the literature, imposing unto yourselves fiscal rules, right? And not only limitations on debt, on public investments, on government guarantees and liabilities and so on, but also it involves Parliament in a greater way, because the disclosure that's required by Treasury to Parliament makes it a more collective decision. If we need to go into deficits, it has to be via the Parliament, as opposed to the discretion is given to the finance minister. So I think this is the first finance minister who actually devolved his authority to Parliament. And it's an important thing, not just in the discipline point of view, but it's also a recognition that for too long, well, since 1974-75, when we had oil, oil is highly distortionary to Malaysia's economy. Oil is one of those things where it's not participative. You know the whole adage about taxation without representation. I think the reason why VAT, whatever GST, is good is because it is taxation with representation, because you're worried about how the money is being spent. But if more of oil revenues pay for government expenditure than personal income tax, then the participative nature of funding the government is not there. So the Fiscal Responsibility Act basically enlarges the decision-making to include Parliament, and therefore imposes greater discipline, or at the very least, greater disclosure involvement of Parliament in that fiscal policy, and not just what it used to be, which was actually highly concentrated power, discretionary power at the finance minister. So then Bank Negara is happy because then Bank Negara can then have a better conversation than Fra. But Fra is younger than me, so he's less jaded than me.
Before I come back to age, Fra, Dr. Carmelo, do you think the fiscal, at least based on our experiences globally, things like Fiscal Responsibility Act, is it enough? Or when we do things very responsibly, politicians see that level going down, wonderful, I've got more money to spend, there will always be a temptation. Or do you think we need something like Congressional Budget Office just to support, or OBR kind of bodies to support that framework even further?
Yeah, indeed, here the problem is precisely the primacy of rules over discretion, which is something that eventually extends also to monetary policy, not only fiscal. And I think that putting the problem of the budget deficit into Parliament is a step forward, but it may not be enough in the sense that we may establish that deficit cannot be beyond a certain percentage of GDP or beyond a certain percentage of revenues, but then if a parliament majority that support the government can change that limit, then we are back to square one. And this is something that we see in the United States. We always go to the limit and then they find an agreement. This is something that I think has been at least partially overcome in the European Union, because then the decision is taken out of the states and there is a sovereign national organism with all its limitations, the European Parliament or the Commission, that decides for the nations, and if they want to remain in the Union, they can't break that rule.
Ejifra, with this new landscape, I see two things, maybe two and a half. One of them is getting rid of all these distortions. Hopefully we have some productivity effects and the central bank has to measure that. That's one thing, not still important, but I guess on the benefit side, you are going to have a much clearer road ahead of you in terms of fiscal when you are conducting monetary policy with these changes. But at the same time, let's stick to subsidy side, it will no longer insulate you from inflation on the inflation side. So your headline inflation will definitely deviate from core much more. And you will need to work out whether this is something we look through, or are we going to have second round effects, and that needs to be communicated much more, or maybe interest rate volatility is going to go up much more. So a number of challenges there.
What you're saying, Ozer, is that after all this is all done with, for example, we have the subsidy rationalization, we have fiscal in a much better position, for example. The immediate effect, of course, is the subsidy rationalization where inflation will go up, right? You mentioned about if before, what you're hinting at is that perhaps my forecast of inflation is easier because there's subsidy. I wouldn't say it's easier. It's very much thanks to my staff who's in the audience, perhaps, churning those forecasts. They are not always easy. But in the sense that when you go forward, there is a great deal element of free movement of prices, right? Be it in terms of fuel prices, be it in terms of sellers reacting to the removal of the subsidy, and perhaps they adopt a new pricing decision to price their products. So meaning the forecast of inflation, which is very important for monetary policy, is about to get a lot harder than what it is now. Now, to some extent, that is a known unknown, right? We have to forecast inflation right. Monetary policy, after all, works with a lag. We have to see where inflation is heading so that we can calibrate policy to bring inflation to a much better level to support the economy. That's a known unknown. What's a tougher one would be in terms of how would, to some extent, the financial markets react to this new reality? Because monetary policy works to the transmission mechanism and it operates a lot to the financial markets. Now, we will be operating in a market where debt is still high, government debt, so that is being clawed down. So there'll be a lot of market movements in that sense, and there'll be price changes, which is, like you said, it ought to rise, and it has to be a lot more challenging. So I have to forecast first inflation, and then secondly, in terms of the health of my transmission mechanism, how it's going to react. So both are going to make my job more challenging. But having said that, I must stress that when inflation goes up because of, say, subsidy rationalization or policy changes or some supply shocks, it's not automatic that monetary policy should react. We have seen in the past where we had episodes of price adjustments in fuel, in gas, where it went up and then the prices went up immediately and then it came down. Now, monetary policy is a demand management tool. There's nothing I can do if prices go up to these shocks. But I have to watch carefully in terms of, like I said, price behavior, price expectations, reaction of the market. And that is harder to guess going forward. But in a sense, that's my immediate task. But over the longer run, again, I go back to the point where it's bringing us closer to that region of stability, where the transmission ought to be better. There's less risk in the economy. The two policies are working in tandem, in coherence. It ought to be better for the economy in the long run. So despite the short-term challenges, I'm open to it. I welcome it. Let's hope that things turn out such that we bring closer to the center of the region of stability. Thanks.
The anchoring of expectations is also going to be making sure things are still anchored. Right? We have got a few more minutes. Dr. Nugsari, if I may come back to you, assuming what I was speculating turns out to be correct, i.e. monetary policy needs to do now more because prices are moving more. Sometimes some of those effects might have second round effect or demand effect. Those more volatile interest rates or more movements, variations in interest rates are going to have implications for fiscal policy as well. Right.
It's going to be tough. I mean, a Treasury officer will never say what I'm going to say. It's going to be tough because you are trying to alter consumption decisions and of households, and not just households, but also businesses on investment decisions. And the reason for why the distortion in allocation happened in the low interest rate regime that was prolonged was basically everybody reads the same corporate finance book and then they use all these same formulas, and then when R is almost zero, then decisions that were undertaken were wrong. So now we are adjusting prices significantly, and that requires household consumption decision to alter quite a bit, and firms as well. So it will not be easy. I've spoken to people, because I'm not from that school of thought, this behavioral stuff. I'm a very bad psychologist, whatever behavioral stuff. So, but I have some sympathy that sort of understanding on how decisions are made in consumption, in investments, in allocation of resources, needs to be taken into account more. And the difficult part of the hat that I'm wearing is to convince the government to say that actually, if you do this, you can build a stronger safety net, because you really need a stronger safety net while you are transitioning from this period that we've gone through to another period. So in order to build a strong safety net, you need fiscal space to do that. In order to have fiscal space to do that, you need to do some of the hard decisions, because there will be those who will have to pay some price, and you need a strong safety net to do that. But it's not easy to convince somebody like the Prime Minister and say, So now now the thing has gone out and say, how come they're smuggling 20 billion of diesel, and why can't we put a stop to that? It's exactly the statement of the Prime Minister. Why do you want me to raise prices when you tell me at the same time, there's some people making 20 billion selling subsidized diesel. So it's not an easy decision to make. But what is necessary is actually we need to formalize the safety net, and we need to professionalize it. We need to put that in place. We need to finance it. And in order to do that, we have to take money from somewhere else. So that's not easy, I'll have to admit. But I'm not a treasury officer, so just an advisor. So.
Dr. Carmelo, briefly before we go to Q&A, what do you see the challenges in this new landscape in terms of interactions?
Well, indeed, I think we will have to see, in particular, how strong the effects on prices will be from the subsidy rationalization. And this will put the challenge and will determine how hard the mission for the central bank will be. But I think that a common understanding will have to be found in order to realize that in order to fight inflation is not enough to raise interest rates. So it's not the only weapon. And the Fiscal Responsibility Act, so constrained on the fiscal side, will be, according to my view, even more important than raising interest rate to keep inflation at bay. If we have this common understanding that inflation cannot be controlled just by the central bank, but requires fiscal responsibility, then I think we will be able to navigate successfully through the challenges.
I think no central banker would say no to the central bank's needs-made kind of statements. Can we go back to, go to Q&A, please? We've got a number of questions. I think this is going to be exciting. May I start with the first one to Dr. Nugsari? As an economic advisor to the government, do you think the government should consider to reintroduce GST?
Wow, can get fired for this. Okay.
We don't want that.
Anything that broadens the revenue base, and more importantly, not just broaden the revenue base, but provides buoyancy to the revenue, is welcome. And the VAT, or whatever you want to call it, GST, is one of those things. See, the problem with our tax base is that it's not very buoyant. You know, you have a 1% growth in GDP, you don't really have 1% growth in tax revenue because of the way we use tax policy. I think one of the underappreciated lever of fiscal policy is actually the taxation side. People have not really looked at the taxation side. We're so obsessed on the expenditure side. So, you know, there's a roundabout way of answering that question.
Do you think that is a side effect of what you mentioned earlier about the effect of having oil? We didn't think about tax policy more because we had oil revenue, for example.
No, this one of the things that is not appreciated. See, if a big chunk of government's revenue is not paid for by tax, then the accountability of the expenditure is less, and hence that's why you have this resource-scarce business. If the good thing, now I'm speaking as an economist, the good thing about value-added tax is that everybody pays for it. Then everybody then is concerned about how that money is being paid. So the governance is actually better. Now the issue about that has always been, is it a regressive thing? So if it's regressive, there can be measures on the strengthening the floor, the safety net, to ameliorate the regressiveness of the instrument. But surely it is a much better tax. It will provide a stronger base. If you look at the, sorry to belabor this point, if you look at the revenue structure of governments across the region, Frau would know this very well, indirect taxes, direct taxes, non-tax revenue. Malaysia has one of the most skewed distribution of tax revenue because people have indirect taxes as the greater contributors of revenue. We have direct taxes as the greatest contributor of revenue. Why? Because we have a big chunk called non-tax revenues. And that non-tax revenue in the era of post-carbon world, post-oil, whatever, and the fact that we are now taking so much from Petronas that they are not doing enough reinvestment to explore more and more difficult wells, and in order to pay the kinds of dividends that they've been paying. So it's not sustainable. So that's your answer. Yeah.
Ajifra, this question is to you, I believe. Given the current and future state of government's fiscal balance and priorities, what can the BNM do further safeguard and enhance the efficacy of monetary policy?
I remember as a student, when I first studied this monetary and fiscal policy, there was an analogy put, and I think it's a bad analogy, but it works for me. Monetary policy is like a lever to control the air conditioning in the room. You want to adjust the temperature in the room, you adjust it, right? And it takes time for the temperature to change. Because at the end of the day, you want a comfortable room. Now, fiscal policy is the one that is the interior decorator of the room, right? You put bed, you put curtains, you put whatever, it affects the room ambience directly and faster than monetary policy, right? But to the extent that you put a curtain in front of the air conditioning, then, they're not work in tandem. So it affects the comfort in the room. So go to this, so I think it works. So I somehow remember that, So when you talk about, what would be the priorities, what would be the challenges for us? I think it's important that for both the air conditioner controller and the interior decorator to talk to each other, right? To make sure that you both understand what's your effect on one another. So going back specifically to that question, the good thing is that, for us at least, Bank Negara, we sit in the Fiscal Policy Committee, we sit in the National Economic Action Council, we sit in all the policy forums. We are, I wouldn't say the best of buddies, but we still talk to each other. So that's a very good thing. Of course, one of our roles is an advisor to the government. And as advisors, as Dr. Nung said, sometimes we advise, they don't always listen. And let me defend the government here. Let me defend the government here. Because sometimes it's a question of policy horizon. You want things to happen immediately, whereas, they have other immediate priorities and they postpone it, some leave it to the political cycles. I would believe in the wisdom of them in sometimes having a longer policy horizon to do a lot of things. But to the extent that we can influence that, then we are better off rather than simply working in dissonance, working in separate parts. A very roundabout way to answer your question. I have my board member here, and I have government officials in the audience.
Maybe on that topic, I should go to Dr. Carmelo.
Yes.
Who's not working for the government.
Sorry, about the same...
Yes, please.
Well, can we display the question again? Sorry.
It was what should the central bank do in this new landscape to maintain the efficacy of monetary policy? But feel free to deviate from that more towards fiscal policy.
No, I tend to agree with the comments of Assistant Governor. Coordination with the government is crucial, and there is. I really believe that there is not much that the central bank can do if there is not fiscal responsibility first. So if the government is committed to maintain discipline, and this can be done not only improving the revenue collection, but also, and in particular, controlling the way in which money are spent, then the central bank cannot keep on playing the role of the firefighter, you know. So we cannot ask miracles to the central bank. So coordination is important, but responsibility from the fiscal side is extremely important.
Okay, here's a question, Eddie Taker. In your view, what is the main structural reform that Malaysia needs to pursue to solidify long-term macroeconomic performance?
For me as well?
A short one from each of you, if possible,
okay.
Please.
So for me, the fiscal reform, I think we really need to consolidate the way in which we collect revenues. In the past year, a lot of micro taxes have been added. I think we need to do more for consolidation and enforcement.
I think once relative prices are altered, hopefully resource allocation will be made more efficient, and then we won't depend on investment decisions or consumption decisions that are based on distorted prices, and then we would then find more new things, better things to do as an economy than just doing more of the same things, because we are constrained by, not we are constrained, we are incentivized in the wrong way to perpetuate the already existing interests that we have. And I think, therefore, that also explains why change is actually very difficult, because there's so much vested interest to preserve the status quo as opposed to change it.
One thing about Malaysia, I mean, if you look at our history, we've always been prolific reformers, actually. Malaysia is a successful country in the sense that we have transformed ourselves in the past 50 years to be where we are now. So having said that, you know, because of COVID, because of politics, you know, we've gone slow a bit on the structural reform in the past few years. So, and when that happens, there's a lot to catch up. And it's not easy to do a lot at the same time. But if we don't, then you're ever stuck in an environment where it gets harder and harder and harder to do it. So I like, in the sense that what has happened is that there has been a very good diagnosis of what's the problem that affects us. You know, you can look at the Radhi document. The first part is all about problems that affect us. And then the solutions, the strategy in terms of getting us out. And mind you, having so much to do, sequence is important, timing is important, how you do it is important. So in that sense, it has to be incoherent and in concert with one another. So take for example, you talk about, you know, subsidy reforms. It starts with diesel, where I suppose in many sense it's less direct in terms of the implication to the people. But it gets harder after that, because then you tackle RON 95. But so you need a mechanism to alleviate the pain that is being felt by the ones who are most affected by it. No, let me rephrase that. The ones who are most affected by it are the ones who drive the big cars, and so it's really the B20, the B40. So they need the largest share of income transfers, for example. So there needs to be a mechanism to allow that to happen. And then there needs to be coherence over the longer term goals. You can't have sustainability goals and effort, you know, when prices of petrol are so cheap, where everybody drives more and more. You know, if you look at the data in terms of our importation of fuel, it gets higher, whereas in other countries compared to our neighbors, it gets lower. Why? Because prices are too low. So there needs to be this sequence of adjustments such that the reforms that we're taking are coherent, fits into one another, and together, hopefully, it turns into a virtuous cycle and it gets easier and easier. The first part is always very difficult. Of course, you know, you'll see the social media and everybody goes into an uproar about this. So we need to be patient, we need to be steadfast, and we need to be transparent and clear in terms of explaining it, despite perhaps a very angry population and audience. I'll pause here.
Dr. Nugsari, as the fiscal authority on the podium, I know you've got some constraints about the government thing, but do you have views on the sequencing of the reforms?
One thing that maybe the elephant in the room is actually we need to recognize that the period of some political stability that we've enjoyed since the first 50 years, 60 years, will no longer be there, actually. It will be more of collaborative, more... it's not going to be like one government with one party for 50 years. And then you can have stability in terms of policy framework. So it'll be a bit more noisy, a bit more noisy. That's what I'm going to say. And then, which therefore requires a lot more collaboration, a lot more communication, a lot more convincing, which is actually a good thing in a democratic sense, because it's more participative in that sense. But it requires a different sort of thinking and different sort of maneuvering through parliament, and then it hopefully will change politics into a better way, because when you talk about fiscal policy, it's actually the political market is trying to decide how to allocate resources. So hopefully the political markets improve as a result, and people get more involved, and therefore they elect, like better representative to go to parliament and discuss about these things, as opposed to a bunch of idiots who don't discuss it properly. So then we get into the virtuous cycle that Fra is alluding to. Or for the record, in the last century, through some loss of memory, I was also a member of parliament. So.
All good things come to an end. We've got 3 minutes left. Final words from our speakers, if they would like to. Starting from Dr. Carmelo.
Thank you. My final remark is that in order to navigate cycles in the future, I think we need to rediscover the primacy of rules over discretion, both in fiscal policy and in monetary policy. Last year was the 30th anniversary of the Taylor rule. So it has been abandoned over the years, but maybe it's the time after a couple of decades very much marked by discretion in monetary policy, is the time to rediscover also the importance of rules.
I'll just, unless I go off the floor thinking people I'm such a party pooper kind of guy. Actually, I'm actually a half glass, half full kind of guy, actually. I'm a glass full kind of guy, and think despite some of the noises around questioning our existential, raison d'etre or whatever, I think I'm very optimistic because I tend to believe that the more voices they are involved in decision making, the better it will be. The noisier it will be, but of course, the better it will be. So I'm actually quite bullish about the future. And also because I felt that people like me and sitting all these old people there, we inherited a Malaysia that gave us a lot of things, and we benefited a lot from it. So I think we owe it to leave behind a better Malaysia for those younger than us. So I think quite optimistic on that.
Yeah. The policy scene is about to get more complicated. I said a moment ago that we have been lagging in terms of reform, and we want to do it now, and we want to do it fast. So, and a lot of us, including the ones in this room and on this stage, we've been asking for reforms, and now the reforms come, and it's going to be like Dr. Nung said, it's going to be difficult, it's going to be noisy, it's going to be boisterous. But hopefully, if we are doing it based on information, based on sound research, based on informed judgment, guided by transparency and a healthy debate, we're in a much better position. So hopefully, we are closer to that virtuous cycle, despite all the noise that we are seeing now. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you to all our speakers and participants with their questions and everything. I hope you enjoyed the session. And it is lunchtime. Enjoy your lunch and see you in the afternoon. Thank you.